The highway unspooled before them like a gray ribbon that refused to end. Michael kept both hands on the wheel, shoulders tight, while beside him Claire tapped at her phone until the signal bars thinned and finally disappeared into blankness. In the back seat, their two children, Ethan, 13, and Lily, 9, swung between sullen silence and bursts of complaint. The car was full in the way only a family uprooted from a decade of city life could be. Boxes of kitchen utensils balanced against the back window, a lampshade sliding precariously, the children's backpacks stuffed with whatever they refused to let the movers touch. The movers were scheduled to arrive a day later, which meant the four of them were driving not only toward a new life but also into a long evening of sleeping bags and takeout cartons in a house that still smelled of other people. Michael liked to imagine that he was steering them into possibility. He had told himself, and then repeatedly told Claire, that the countryside would reset them. Space, clean air, a slower rhythm, less poisoned by the commute and the small angers of apartment living, the upstairs neighbor who vacuumed at midnight, the endless battle for street parking, the price of everything. Claire had nodded along in the early conversations, but her assent always felt provisional, like she was signing a short-term contract rather than agreeing to a shared dream. She worked in graphic design, and most of her clients were city-based. Moving meant more isolation, more video calls where her face froze mid-sentence. She worried about losing not just work but also the fragile web of friends she'd pieced together over the years. Now, as the skyline receded and fields began to dominate the horizon, she caught herself thinking that the worst part was how permanent it looked. The endless stretches of farmland weren't beautiful to her, they were blank. In the backseat, Ethan pushed his earbuds deeper. He was at the age when his body felt like a betrayal, too tall, too thin, a voice cracking at unpredictable intervals. His phone had been his lifeline, his tether to school friends, memes, late-night group chats. Out here, without service, the silence pressed on him like a punishment. Lily, meanwhile, narrated every passing cow, every sagging barn, until Ethan snapped at her to shut up. She burst into tears, and Claire twisted around to mediate, her voice sharp with fatigue. Michael drove on, jaw clenched. He had imagined this differently. He had pictured a kind of pioneer spirit, the family united against the disarray of the move. But already the fault lines were visible. The house itself stood at the edge of a narrow road, flanked by overgrown hedges and a lopsided mailbox. It was older than Michael remembered from the real estate listing, its clapboard siding faded, the porch tilted just slightly. Yet it had 3 bedrooms, a patch of yard, and a monthly mortgage that felt like deliverance compared to the city. If the move itself had carried with it a certain pulse of excitement, boxes unpacked, fresh rooms to claim, routines to establish, what followed in the weeks after was a quieter, more insidious challenge. The Kearneys had imagined that the countryside would confer ease, but what settled into their lives was not ease so much as weight. The mornings were colder than they had expected. The house, with its drafty windows and antiquated furnace, seemed to exhale chill air through the floors. Michael rose earlier than he had in the city, fumbling with the temperamental heating system before putting on coffee. He had imagined a rustic calm, perhaps even the ritual pleasure of splitting wood, but the reality was a slow irritation. The woodpile was damp, the kindling never caught right, and the heating oil bill that arrived in the mail already felt punitive. Claire, meanwhile, found that the charm of open fields quickly dulled against the fact that there was nowhere to walk. In the city she had strolled to the cafe, the bookstore, the florist, each destination offering a rhythm to her days. Here, the only walking seemed to be along the shoulder of a county road, where trucks sped past too close. She drove more than she ever had, and the drives were long, the scenery repeating itself until it blurred into sameness. The children, Anna and Jacob, wore their discomfort less subtly. Anna, 12, had begun middle school in town and arrived home daily with a tight face, her backpack thudding onto the floor like a declaration. The other girls already had alliances formed, and Anna was the outsider, the city girl with the slightly different clothes, the accent that marked her as not from here. Jacob, 9, tried harder to blend in, but his attempts to impress boys at recess only seemed to backfire. leaving him with grass stains and a wary silence at dinner. Evenings became a strain. In the city, Michael had stayed later at work, and Claire had busied herself with errands or visits. Here, by 5 o'clock, they were all under the same roof, the country night pressing against the windows like a heavy curtain. They cooked together at first, pasta, stews, but the meals grew repetitive and the children complained. Michael sometimes opened a second beer before the plates were cleared, the bitterness of it lingering as he stared at the news on his laptop. Claire scrolled her phone in silence. The marriage, once frayed at the edges, began to pull apart in more visible seams. The small irritations grew louder in the absence of distractions. Claire noticed how Michael left his boots by the back door, mud hardening into the rug. Michael resented Claire's sighs when she passed the cluttered kitchen counter. What had once been ignorable, submerged in the noise of city life, now rose clearly to the surface, like scum in still water. The neighbors did little to ease the transition. The nearest family was half a mile down the road, and though they waved politely when their pickup passed, there was little conversation. At the grocery store, Claire overheard the small pauses after she spoke, the way cashiers glanced at her clothes or the out-of-state license plate. Michael told himself this was just rural reserve, but he, too, felt the subtle exclusion at the diner, where conversations quieted as he and Claire walked in. It was Anna who suffered most acutely. She had once been outspoken, quick with jokes, but now she kept to her room, earbuds in, sketchbook open. One night, Claire knocked softly and found her daughter in tears. "They say I'm weird," Anna whispered. "That I think I'm better than them. But I don't. I just don't know how to talk the way they do." Claire gathered her in her arms, but felt a helplessness sink into her bones. Jacob, less vocal, expressed his dislocation through small rebellions. He dawdled in the mornings, misplaced his homework, refused to brush his teeth until Claire's voice rose sharp. When Michael tried to intervene, Jacob shouted, "I hate it here," and slammed his door. The words hung in the hallway long after, echoing Claire's own private sentiment. By late October, the air turned raw, the leaves brittle. The Kearneys went to a fall festival in town, hoping to knit themselves into the community. They bought cider, watched a hayride circle the fields. But the townspeople clustered in familiar groups, and the Kearneys hovered at the edges, smiling awkwardly. Jacob tugged Michael's sleeve, asking to go home. Anna stood rigid, as though refusing to acknowledge the isolation. Driving back, Michael gripped the wheel too tightly, the headlights carving a narrow tunnel through the dark. In private moments, Michael and Claire nursed unspoken regrets. Michael missed the city library, the smell of used books and coffee mingling. He missed his colleagues, the casual conversation that reminded him of his own relevance. Claire missed the anonymity, the sense that she could disappear into a crowd, unjudged. They had not expected that in the country, each difference would stand out, magnified. One night, after another strained dinner, Michael tried to articulate his unease. "I thought this would bring us closer," he said, the beer bottle cool in his hand. "But it feels like everything's harder. Like we're being tested all the time." Claire looked at him, tired. "Maybe we wanted something that doesn't exist. You thought the move would fix us. But maybe we were already." She trailed off, unwilling to say broken. The silence that followed was not angry, but heavy. Both of them knew that something essential had shifted, that the move had not erased their fractures but exposed them more starkly. The children sensed it too. Anna, lying in bed, heard the low murmur of her parents' voices through the floorboards and wondered if all families lived this way, in quiet tension. Jacob, restless, began having stomachaches before school, the dread pulling in his small body. As winter approached, the days shortened, the darkness arriving early. The house creaked in the cold, and the family moved through their routines with a kind of trudging persistence. The dream of renewal that had propelled them here now seemed naive, and though no one admitted it out loud, each carried the thought that they might have made a mistake too big to reverse. By the third month in the countryside, the Kearneys had learned that silence could be louder than any argument. The farmhouse walls, thin, uninsulated, perpetually chilled, seemed to absorb every unspoken resentment. The family sat together at the long wooden table, bowls of soup steaming in front of them, and said little. The food cooled faster than anyone ate it. Claire would glance at Michael, waiting for him to acknowledge the obvious, that things were not working, but his eyes remained fixed on his spoon, as if the broth held a solution that eluded her. The children fared no better. Lily, 12, once quick to chatter about books and gossip from school, had withdrawn into monosyllables. She ate mechanically, then retreated upstairs, where she scrolled endlessly through her phone, until the weak rural signal failed her and she slammed the device shut with a force that shook the walls. Henry, 10, tried to bridge the gap with jokes, but they landed poorly, met with distracted nods or absent smiles. Slowly, he, too, fell into silence, his shoulders slumped as if carrying some invisible burden. At school, Lily had become the girl from somewhere else, an intruder. She wore clothes from the city, jeans a shade too dark, sneakers too clean, and that was enough to make her a target. Her classmates asked if she thought she was better than them. They laughed at her flat vowels, the way she said, water, with a clipped precision that betrayed her origins. She came home one afternoon with her notebooks vandalized, crude sketches in the margins, words she wouldn't repeat out loud. Claire tried to comfort her, but Lily's face closed off, and she said only, "You don't understand." Henry's struggle was quieter but more cutting. He wasn't bullied outright, but excluded in subtler ways. Not chosen for soccer teams, not invited to birthday parties. At recess, he lingered near the fence, kicking gravel, watching groups form and dissolve without ever being part of them. When Claire asked how his day had gone, he replied with forced cheer, "Fine," but she noticed the way he clutched his backpack strap, knuckles white. Claire herself felt alien in the village. Neighbors greeted her politely but without warmth, their conversations clipped. At the small grocery store, women who had known each other since childhood continued their chatter without including her. She stood by the bins of potatoes and onions, pretending to compare prices, her cheeks burning. On Sundays, she brought the children to church, thinking it might help them belong. But the pews were filled with families who glanced at them with mild curiosity, never hostility, but never welcome either. Michael was less troubled, or claimed to be. "They just need time," he said. "We all do." He insisted that the move had been the right decision, that they had traded noise and pollution for authenticity, that the children would toughen up, that Claire herself would find her rhythm. But his words rang hollow, especially when he returned late from his freelance work in town, shoulders tense, eyes shadowed. Claire suspected he carried regrets he would not name. He guarded his disappointment as if admitting it would unravel everything. The fracture widened one night over dinner. Lily had come home from school tear-streaked, a test paper crumpled in her hand. She had failed, her first real failure. The teacher had mocked her accent when she read aloud, the class had laughed, and she had stumbled through the rest of the day in humiliation. At the table, she pushed her food away. "I want to go back," she said suddenly. "I hate it here, everyone hates me." Claire reached for her hand, but Lily pulled it back. Michael cleared his throat. "Lily, it's just an adjustment. It'll get better." "No, it won't," she snapped. "You don't get it. You don't even care." Michael bristled. "Of course I care, but running back isn't the answer. You'll learn to fit in if you give it time." "That's easy for you to say," Lily shot back. "You don't have to sit alone every day at lunch." The room froze. Henry's fork clattered against his plate. Claire looked at Michael, hoping he would soften, but his jaw set harder. "We didn't move here for nothing," he said. "This is good for us. For all of us." "Good for you," Lily muttered. "Not for me." Then she stormed upstairs, her door slamming like a gavel. Henry's eyes brimmed. "I don't like it here either," he whispered. Claire felt something break in her chest. She turned to Michael, desperate. "Do you hear them? Do you see what this is doing?" Michael's voice rose. "What do you want me to say, Claire? That I made a mistake? That we should crawl back to the city with our tails between our legs? We're not quitters. This isn't about pride," she snapped. "It's about our children." For the first time, Henry cried openly, his small shoulders shaking. Claire pulled him into her arms, glaring at Michael over the boy's head. Michael, seeing his son's tears, faltered. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then left the table without another word. The fracture was no longer hidden, it had split the family open. In the weeks that followed, the house grew colder, not just from the failing furnace, but from the absence of warmth between its inhabitants. Claire and Michael spoke in clipped exchanges about bills, groceries, school schedules. Their intimacy had withered into bureaucracy. Nights, Claire lay awake listening to the wind rattle the windows, remembering the city apartment they had left behind. Cramped, noisy, but alive with neighbors' footsteps, car horns, the distant hum of life. Here, the silence pressed on her chest until she could hardly breathe. Michael, for his part, retreated into chores. He chopped wood obsessively, stacked logs with military precision, repaired fences that did not need repairing. His hands cracked from the cold, his back ached, but he welcomed the pain. It was easier than confronting the collapse of his vision. He had imagined the move as a chance to reclaim something authentic, but now authenticity tasted like ash. One evening, Claire found Lily curled up on her bed, headphones on, eyes wet. She sat beside her daughter, stroked her hair, and whispered, "We'll figure this out." But Lily only shook her head. Henry began feigning illness to avoid school. At first Claire indulged him, keeping him home with tea and blankets. But after the third day, she insisted he go. He looked at her with betrayal, as if she had sided with the enemy. The Kearneys were not yet broken, but they were bending dangerously. Every interaction carried the weight of the move, every silence echoed with the question none dared ask aloud. Had they ruined their lives chasing an illusion? Winter descended in earnest. The fields outside lay barren under frost, the roads slick and treacherous. Inside, the family moved through the house like ghosts, each confined to separate rooms. Michael by the fire, papers spread across his lap. Claire in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with mechanical rhythm. Lily upstairs, light glowing beneath her door. Henry drifting between them, unsettled, like a child searching for a place that no longer existed. The fracture was no longer a crack, it was a canyon. And yet, as Franzen might have said, families rarely collapse in a single dramatic gesture. More often, they erode, inch by inch, until one day you look back and realize the bridge is gone. It happened in small ways first, the kind of domestic slips that in another household might have been shrugged off, but here, in the fragile, already cracking silence of the Kearneys, acquired a weight disproportionate to their cause. Emily began, forgetting her homework in the bottom of her backpack. Daniel stopped telling his parents who he ate lunch with, if anyone at all. Claire noticed the lies not because they were bold, but because they lacked even the energy to be convincing. The call came from the school counselor one Tuesday afternoon. Claire, already exhausted after a morning of battling with the ancient washing machine, heard the phone's shrill insistence and felt her stomach knot even before she picked it up. Emily had been caught crying in the bathroom between classes, unable, or unwilling, to explain herself. "It might be helpful if you and your husband could come in," the counselor suggested gently, as though this were a problem to be managed by teamwork rather than two people who had forgotten how to even sit in the same room without bristling. Claire dreaded telling Michael. He arrived home late that night, shoulders tight from the long commute into the city for work he no longer believed in. Over dinner, with Daniel listlessly pushing peas across his plate, she relayed the message. Michael's jaw stiffened, his fork clinking too loudly against the dish. "So now it's our fault," he muttered. "I didn't say that," Claire replied, keeping her voice level. "You don't have to." The children exchanged quick, guilty glances, then buried themselves in the food they had no appetite for. The following Thursday, Michael and Claire found themselves seated in two plastic chairs outside the counselor's office, like teenagers waiting to be scolded. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and pencil shavings. Michael tapped his foot. Claire clasped her hands so tightly in her lap her knuckles widened. When they were ushered inside, the counselor, a young woman with careful, sympathetic eyes, spoke first. "Emily's been having a difficult time adjusting. She feels isolated." The word hovered in the air. Claire wanted to ask, isolated from what? From her peers at school, who snickered at her accent. From her parents, who barely looked at each other except to argue. From herself? She says she doesn't feel at home anywhere, the counselor added softly. Claire's throat constricted. She could feel Michael stiffen beside her, the heat of his defensiveness rising like a wall. She'll be fine, he said too quickly. Kids exaggerate. We moved here for them, to give them space, safety. She'll adjust. Claire shot him a look. You think this is just exaggeration? It's normal, he insisted, though the tremor in his voice betrayed uncertainty. Middle school is hard everywhere. The counselor, wisely, didn't argue. She simply laid out resources. Group sessions, after-school clubs, strategies for easing the transition. Claire nodded gratefully, though she knew Michael wasn't listening. What haunted her wasn't Emily's crying, it was that her daughter hadn't come to her first. Once upon a time, Emily had spilled every secret in breathless whispers before bed. Now she locked herself in her room, a fortress of silence Claire could not breach. That evening, after the children were asleep, Claire and Michael found themselves in the kitchen, the only light the dim overhang above the sink. Dishes crowded the counter, remnants of a meal no one had enjoyed. We can't keep pretending everything's fine, Claire said quietly. Michael leaned against the counter, arms folded. So what do you want me to say? That moving was a mistake? Her silence was answer enough. You think I don't question it every day? He snapped, the veneer of control finally cracking. I leave before dawn, I drive an hour and a half each way, I sit in an office where half the time I'm praying nobody remembers I exist, because at least that way I can get home before the kids are in bed. And for what? For a house you can't stand, neighbors who don't speak to us, children who think we ruined their lives. His voice broke on the last word. Claire had the sudden, irrational impulse to reach for him, to lay a hand on his arm. But pride, her own carefully sharpened armor, held her back. Instead she said, you didn't ask us. You decided, and now we're all paying for it. Michael's face tightened. For a moment he looked not angry but weary, ancient, like a man twice his age. The fracture widened in the weeks that followed. Emily withdrew further, her laughter, once a household soundtrack, disappearing. Daniel, in the cruel logic of younger siblings, compensated with louder antics, desperate to be noticed. Claire moved through her days like a ghost, her thoughts circling endlessly around escape plans she would never enact. An apartment back in the city, weekends with friends who still remembered her before she became half of a rural experiment. Michael buried himself in work, though it offered no solace. On the drive home one night, headlights sweeping across empty fields, he pulled over on the side of the road and sat with the engine idling. The silence pressed in on him, so complete he could hear his own pulse. He realized with a start that he couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed. Really laughed, the kind that shakes you loose from yourself. The reckoning came in the form of Emily's report card. Grades that had once hovered comfortably in the realm of A's and B's now sagged under the weight of C's, with a note attached in the teacher's clipped handwriting. Emily shows potential but lacks engagement. Michael stared at the paper across the dinner table, his chest tightening. This isn't acceptable, he said. Emily's eyes welled with tears. I'm trying. You're not trying hard enough. Something in Claire snapped. Do you hear yourself? She's drowning, Michael. She needs us, not lectures. And what do you suggest? His voice rose, sharp and brittle. That we coddle her? Tell her it's fine to give up? I suggest, Claire shot back, that you stop pretending this move solved anything. Emily fled the table then, footsteps pounding up the stairs, the slam of her bedroom door reverberating like a gunshot. Daniel sat frozen, wide-eyed, then slipped silently away. The kitchen was suddenly too quiet. Michael stared at the report card, but the words blurred. Claire's hands trembled as she cleared plates no one had touched. Later that night, Michael knocked gently on Emily's door. No answer. He turned the knob anyway, stepping into the dim glow of her desk lamp. She sat cross-legged on the bed, arms wrapped around her knees. I'm sorry, he began awkwardly. I want what's best for you. Emily didn't look up. I hate it here. The words landed with more force than any accusation from Claire ever could. Michael sat down at the edge of the bed, the springs creaking under his weight. He wanted to promise her it would get better, that this was just a phase. But he had no evidence, no faith to offer. Only the raw truth of his own doubt. "I know," he said finally. His voice cracked. "I know." In the quiet hours after midnight, Michael and Claire found themselves again in the kitchen, as though the house itself conspired to force them together in these nocturnal vigils. "I don't know how to fix this," Michael admitted, staring into his coffee mug though it was empty. Claire, bone-tired, leaned against the counter. "Maybe we can't. Maybe it's not about fixing. Maybe it's about showing up, even if it's messy." For a moment, neither spoke. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. Then Michael reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, but close enough that the gesture felt monumental. The air between them softened, just slightly. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was the first fragile acknowledgement that the wreckage they lived in was shared, that neither of them could carry it alone. And perhaps that was the beginning of something, not resolution, not redemption, but a reckoning with the truth, that they had broken something precious, and only by facing it together might they salvage what remained. Winter in the Valley was not the storybook White Michael had once imagined when he argued for this move. Snow came in uneven patches, leaving the ground muddied, the sky gray for weeks. The house seemed to shrink as the family retreated inward, each to their separate corners, yet something subtle shifted that winter. Perhaps it was exhaustion. There were only so many arguments one family could sustain before silence itself became unbearable. Or perhaps, beneath the fatigue, lay a stubborn ember of connection that refused to die. Emily was the first to break the rhythm. One Friday evening she appeared in the kitchen with a stack of notebooks, setting them down on the table where her mother was cutting carrots. "Can you help me with this?" she asked, almost shyly, as if she were 12 again and not the teenager who had spent weeks rolling her eyes at any parental involvement. Claire looked at the equations, her rusty algebra surfacing with effort. They worked quietly together until Michael wandered in, drawn less by the math than by the rare sound of his daughter speaking. He hovered awkwardly, then offered, "I might remember this better than Mom." Emily let him sit down, and for the first time in months, the three of them leaned over the same page. Daniel, not wanting to be left out, pulled a chair with a noisy scrape. "I can check answers on my phone," he announced, proud of his usefulness. The scene was ordinary to the point of banality, yet it stitched something invisible between them. They were, if only for an evening, a family engaged in the same task, not four individuals cohabiting the same cold house. The change was not dramatic. It came in hesitant gestures. Claire setting aside her laptop at dinner, Michael fixing the drafty window in Emily's room without being asked, Daniel volunteering to shovel the path though he did a messy job. None of these erased the resentments or doubts, but they bent the arc of their days ever so slightly toward each other. At church on Christmas Eve, something Claire had suggested more out of nostalgia than devotion, they found themselves seated in the middle pew. Candles flickered, hymns rose, and though Michael sang off-key, Emily's voice floated clear and strong beside him. Claire glanced down the row at her family, their faces lit gold by candlelight, and felt a pang of something both painful and sustaining. This was what she had feared lost forever. Imperfect as they were still hers, still here. The return to school in January was no easier. Emily still struggled with the social codes of rural adolescence, Daniel still bristled at being the outsider. Yet they began to speak of it, haltingly, sometimes angrily, but aloud, at the dinner table. Michael admitted he'd underestimated the difficulty of uprooting them. Claire admitted she sometimes longed for the city more fiercely than she let on. The honesty did not solve anything, but it replaced silence with words, and words at least carried the possibility of being heard. One night, after the children had gone upstairs, Michael and Claire remained at the table with the remains of a pie Daniel had insisted on baking. They spoke about finances, the draft in the roof, and then, quietly, about each other. "I thought we were breaking," Claire said, tracing the rim of her mug. "We were," Michael answered. He did not flinch from it. "Maybe we still are, but I don't want it to finish that way." Neither promised miracles. They knew too well how easily grand declarations soured. Instead, they agreed on small, concrete things. Cooking together once a week, family walks on Sundays, no phones at dinner. Modest, almost laughable goals. But in a house where distance had become habit, even modesty felt like hope. By spring, the valley thawed. The fields turned green, children biked past their house again, and the Kearneys began to resemble, from the outside, a family at ease. Inside, they were still fragile. Emily's grades wavered. Daniel sulked when friends from the city visited and he had little to show. Claire sometimes wept after long days, though she tried to keep it hidden. Michael wrestled with the nagging suspicion that he had made a mistake too large to undo. And yet, woven into the fragility, was a thread of resilience. They had not given up. They had, against the odds, begun again.